Another one until 2016.
Absolutely right. Right you are, Jessica. Many thanks indeed. And it is indeed time for the France 24 debate. Now, what has happened to three journalists thought to be trapped tonight in the Syrian city of Homs? The British photographer Paul Conroy was evacuated last night in an operation that left a dozen or more people dead. But what about Edith Bouvier, William Daniels and Javier Espinosa? Are they still caught in the besieged district of Baba Amma? Well, that remains unknown tonight. What we do know is what went wrong with last night's evacuation. Here's the head of the activist group Avaz, which helped coordinate that rescue.
And the column of the journalists was attacked by shell fire and by sniper fire, and it was split into half. And the group in the front was able to continue on, and Paul Conroy was able to get out of Syria, and the remaining three journalists were forced to turn back, and Edith was among them. She was being carried on a stretcher, and it was too dangerous and too difficult for her to go forward.
Well, the Committee to Protect Journalists says at least 8 journalists have been killed in Syria in the last 4 months. Among them, of course, the Sunday Times reporter Marie Colvin, who was killed in the blast that also broke Edith Bouvier's leg. Well, the deaths and the injuries have fueled international outrage, but the regime in Syria insists that these journalists only have themselves to blame.
The Ministry of Information has given permits to over 170 media outlets. These journalists could not wait and entered an unsafe zone. So they were responsible for what happened there. What we did in this context was to make 3 attempts to evacuate them, but we failed.
Well, tonight I'll be asking if Syria has become too dangerous for foreign journalists or if their profession demands that they keep on reporting the facts, whatever the risks. My guests tonight are Catherine Norris-Trent. As a reporter for France 24, Catherine's covered the fall of Tripoli, as well as conflict in Yemen, Ivory Coast and Madagascar. Also here in the studio is Luis Peral. He's a senior fellow at the European Institute for Security Studies here in Paris. He specialises in international humanitarian law and human rights. And in New York, Robert Mahoney is the Deputy Director of the aforementioned Committee to Protect Journalists. Many thanks indeed to you all for being with us. Robert, I'll start with you if I will. Do you believe that journalists are being deliberately targeted by the regime in Syria? There have been some suggestions that tracking devices are being used to find their satellite phones.
There have been reports that that's the case. It's difficult to get conclusive proof, but the Syrians certainly know who's in the town. The journalists have been filing from in the town, so the army knows where they are. And you know, the fact is that they were in an area where the army was shelling indiscriminately. It seems civilian targets, and the journalists were amongst them. And the Syrians knew that.
Now, for you, is the situation we've seen in Syria over the past few months worse for journalists than we've seen in previous conflicts?
Yeah, well, I think the figures tell the story there, because you've already said that, you know, there's been 11 journalists killed this year, and all but 3 of them have been killed in Syria. It's a tremendously heavy toll. The Committee to Protect Journalists hadn't documented a single death since 1992, before this conflict. So it's an extremely dangerous place to be a journalist at the moment.
Luis Peral, journalists' rights are enshrined in the Geneva Convention, aren't they? They have the same rights as civilians. Soldiers are not allowed to shoot at them. That's considered a war crime. But do you think we're in a situation now where the risk of facing a war crimes trial is outweighed by the importance of stamping out the messengers, stamping out the witnesses to atrocities?
A complex situation and a complex question, I should say. Of course, information is essential in a situation such as that of Syria, and we need to start saying that we can only admire those who risk their lives in order to provide this information. But there are no specific norms, specific rules protecting them, as you said, that are different from those of civilians. War crimes only apply in massive situations, so it wouldn't apply to situations in which the regime or a government is targeting a few persons here and there. That would be covered, of course, by human rights, but not by humanitarian law. And in humanitarian law cases, the main principle is to discriminate between civilians, populations, and of course, journalists are civilian population, and military. and then you can only target the military as such, but never civilians, including journalists. But I wouldn't say that targeting journalists as such is a war crime. The war crime is targeting civilians in big numbers.
All right. Catherine Norris-Trent, as I mentioned, you've reported from many war zones, including, of course, Libya. Do you see differences in what's happening in Syria now to what happened in Libya when you were there?
Well, it's interesting. I went to Libya at various different occasions. The first time was when the Gaddafi regime issued visas for foreign journalists. So we were under their control, although the aim was to try and escape control, report as freely as possible. And then another time behind rebel lines. That was clearly a very different experience. I think from what I've heard from colleagues and people who've been to Syria is that it's very much an extreme situation. It's been going on for a year now. Clearly the situation in Homs is pretty much as dangerous as it gets. Getting in there, extremely difficult, reporting, and then, as we're seeing, getting out. People say in reporting that getting in is one thing, getting out is always much more difficult, and that's clearly what we're seeing with the journalists there, and also finding it very difficult to work when they're there to talk about snipers on rooftops, shells really raining down on the city, so it's an extremely risky undertaking to go there.
And did you ever feel when you were working in Libya that you were at any time being deliberately targeted, that the Gaddafi forces wanted to get rid of you, wanted to shut you up?
Well, when we were working, as it were, under government supervision, then clearly we were assigned minders, and the aim of the game there was to try and work as freely as possible. So that very closely, we were assigned people to try and control us. Behind rebel lines, that's an altogether different proposition. It was a very active battle, very fast-moving front. So I think the regime there was very much trying to just fight that war and try and control the advance of the rebels. So we didn't feel, as journalists, particularly singled out. But it's certainly true that wearing a press badge on the front of your bulletproof jacket is by no means a way of guaranteeing your safety. And in fact, can mark you out as a target, because clearly getting this information out there to the rest of the world is something a regime would want to try and prevent.
Quite right, Robert Mahoney, and that's an interesting point about the visas, isn't it? Because we know that Gilles Jacquet, a French journalist who was killed in Homs recently, he had a visa. He was supposedly under government protection. Does it make any difference at all whether you have a visa or not?
Well, it does make a difference. I mean, that particular case, he was under government protection and he was killed. So it shows that nowhere in Syria is safe. But when the government deliberately tries to choke off information by denying visas and restricting access to journalists through Damascus, getting in legally, then journalists have to take other risks. They have to smuggle themselves across the border, sometimes from Turkey. And then they're extremely vulnerable, because if they get stopped by a patrol or at a checkpoint, then it's game over, because they're in illegally and they could get detained or worse. So if you want to get independent news out of Syria, you have to take that risk, and that's what these journalists in Homs have done.
Now, Marie Colvin, the Sunday Times journalist who was killed last week, not long before she died, she gave a speech at a conference in London. I think we can have a look at what she said. And one of the things she said was that it was very important to assess the risk of a story. And she said that our mission is to report these horrors of war with accuracy and without prejudice. We always have to ask ourselves whether the level of risk is worth the story, what is bravery and what is bravado. Robert Mahoney, how does one make that distinction?
In the end, it's the individual journalist that makes it. Marie Colvin made it for herself, and her answer to that question that she posed was, yes, it is worth it. But a lot of news organizations will make the decision that it's not worth it, even if they employ security companies and consultants to accompany their reporters into the field. But it's down to the individual. There are very few brave journalists like her that would take that risk. You can see that there are only a few there now. But in the end, you put that question to yourself. Marie Colvin was a seasoned war correspondent. She'd been around for nearly 3 decades, and she didn't take risks unnecessarily. She wasn't a war tourist. She wasn't a junkie for the adrenaline of war in that case. But she believed that bearing witness, going and telling the story of the Syrians who were being killed, outweighed in some ways her own considerations for her own personal safety and comfort.
Catherine, that must be a process that you often go through yourself, trying to work out what's brave, what's bravado, what's worth it, and what isn't.
Absolutely, there are several factors which play in. So no mission is ever really the same. So you look at conditions on the ground, who could help you get into that situation, who are your contacts, what exactly will the journey be like, where will you go when you stay there, how safely can you work, and in the end, as Robert Mahoney was saying, you just have to make that decision, and if someone has experienced, as Marie Colvin is in that kind of danger, it just shows it really was one of the most dangerous places to work. And when shells are falling like that, and clearly the number of shells that are falling on a neighbourhood, really sometimes there's just nowhere left to hide. Right. There's no safe place to go, and so there really is no protection for the journalists or any of the civilians in an area like that.
Right, we're hearing figures like 100 civilians dying a day in Syria. It's difficult to protect journalists, it's difficult to protect civilians, isn't it?
If I may go back to the comparison between Libya and Syria, it is clear that, for example, non-governmental organizations were able to enter Benghazi from the very beginning, as compared to the situation in Homs. It's clear that the regime has targeted Homs and has decided to create terror and to show the Syrian population what will happen to the rest of the country if they persist in opposing the regime. So the situation is very different, because NGOs were also, and I referred to information before, the assessment of humanitarian needs is one of the most important issues now as regards Syria. And NGOs in Benghazi were able to assess the needs as regards Libya, but this is not the case now. There are other possibilities, for example, satellite, that could be used as regards the humanitarian needs, which is not necessarily the case with the political situation.
So under that rationale, then, we need the journalists there. We need journalists to show what's going on, and whatever they gather, whatever evidence they get now will be used in any potential war crimes trial in the future, won't it?
We do, but as I said, NGOs are not able to enter Homs now. I have decided that it's not safe enough for them. So this shows the complexity of the situation as compared to that of Libya. But we need information. That's the only thing that could trigger international action. And it's clear that the situation is blocked at the international level.
Robert Mahoney, if I could go back to Syria, looking at what's going on there now, and with the extraordinary level of casualties being reported day to day, do you think it has now become too risky for journalists to go in?
It's extremely risky, and I think news organizations are asking themselves that question now as we speak. And the fact that there aren't that many more journalists on the ground, I think it shows the decisions that they've taken. Still, journalists, especially freelancers, will make that decision, and they may go in there. But look, I mean, you've got a situation where an army has besieged a town and is shelling it. It's somewhat akin to the situation that we saw in Sarajevo or in Grozny. In those circumstances, it is really, really difficult and really dangerous to go in. So most journalists, I think, will make the calculation and won't do it.
And it is different this time around when compared to conflicts such as Iraq, isn't it? When there were foreign forces, when there were American and British troops there were American and British journalists with them. This isn't the case, of course, in Syria. This is Syrians fighting Syrians.
Well, yeah, every conflict is different, and every assessment of the security situation for you as an individual has to be different. Even from day to day, it's different. What you've got in Syria is you've got controlled access into the country, and then you've got a city which is under siege. In Iraq, you had the Americans, journalists could go out. Sometimes it was difficult, but they could go out, they could go back. They maybe had a safe place to spend overnight, like a hotel, like a green zone. In a situation in Syria, you are constantly under threat, because even when you're not working, you can be hit by a mortar or a shell.
And this brings up the point, would it be better, Catherine, to, in this case at least, leave the reporting to local journalists, to Syrians, and as we've seen, civilian journalists, as they call themselves, people posting videos on YouTube and that kind of thing. Perhaps it would be better to leave it to them.
Well, citizen journalists in Syria and elsewhere have played a really key role and done some incredibly brave work trying to get footage, images out there. So really they are playing an important role, and the growth of digital technology and the fact that they are able to send this footage out to the rest of the world has really shone a light on the situation in Syria. Nonetheless, I personally believe it really is important for international journalists from around the world to try, if they believe in the security situation there allows it, to go there. It provides some first-hand reporting. I mean, a lot of the reporting that we've seen coming out of Syria, coming out of Homs, especially we can look at the last reports filed by Marie Colvin. It's really first-hand, really moving reports and describing it in that native mother tongue. I mean, her article is extremely eloquently written, and it really helps to move people around the world and really give them an insight into what's happening. So I believe both have a role to play.
She can also put it in context, given her many years of experience. Civilian journalism's really changed the rules of the game, hasn't it?
It has, and it has been very important for all the changes in the Arab world. But of course, when it comes to conflict situations, the situation cannot be sorted out with civilian journalism. I think we really need something else, and we really need technical assessment of the situation. And as I said, not only of the situation of civilians, of the political environment, but also of the humanitarian needs. But there are different means for doing that. I refer to satellites. I mean, I very recently heard the proposal of drones being able to supervise the situation of the human rights situation instead of bombing in other countries. So we also need to develop different approaches and different ways of assessing what's going on in the ground, in spite of journalists being so brave to be there as well.
And Rob Mahoney, your view on civilian journalism. Your organisation points out that local journalists are more at risk than foreign correspondents, and often 9 out of 10 journalistic deaths are local journalists. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the case. I mean, you know, citizen journalism is a function of technology. It's come up fairly recently. And a lot of the Syrians that we've seen are incredibly brave. They're going out with cameras and phones and recording what they see. Also, there are professional journalists who are employed by visiting correspondents, by overseas correspondents, and they're at risk too. But I mean, to take up the point, you do need professional journalists there as well as citizen journalists. You do need someone who can interview people, who can put the facts into some kind of context and try to make sense of the situation, rather than you getting a stream of snippets of photographs and stuff which isn't connected. And also, professional broadcasters need professional quality video. I mean, we can all see the rather shaky handheld mobile phone images, but at some point, someone has to go and take professional images too. So we need everybody, but the foreign journalists could not do their job without the work and the sacrifice of the local journalists.
Right, and that's just what I want to talk about after this short break. We are going to take a pause, though. When we come back, we'll have the international headlines and the second part of tonight's debate. Don't go away.